Elden Ring's newest update actually made a lot of previously mid-tier builds a lot more viable. We have a bunch of very strong buffs and some nerfs in the new patch 1.13, but as it's always the case with new patches, we gotta take a look at some of the best new options you'll also want to try out. This list includes some of the best options I played around with in 1.13, but there are quite a few more on top that still need a bit more testing before covering them in future videos. That being said, I want to start with Euporia and kind of get it out of the way because this was literally the biggest winner of the new update. Literally, its entire kit got buffed and it's now much easier to stack all of its luster buffs. It only takes 10 of them now instead of previously 20. Also, the duration of the luster buffs is much longer, almost twice. So like a half-charged Euporia now has that buff lasting for almost 50 seconds compared to previously only about like 20. And also a full charge Euporia now lasts for about like 30 seconds compared to previously only like 15, give or take. Plus you have a massive increase in the holy damage that you get from the luster buffs as well. And when you couple this with an already amazing vortex skill that we had on it, you're absolutely going to wreck enemies. I mean, just completely demolishing Relana right here. Now, the thing about Euporia is that it kinda lacks stagger abilities, so you can easily get just thrown out of all of these animations. So that is why I kinda like using the charged heavies. Not only does it let me also stagger enemies, eventually even stun them, but it's also a much better way and a faster way to just build up a full luster 10 series of buffs. It only takes 2 charged heavies to basically reach a fully charged Euporia, and by that time you may even like stun an enemy so that you can unleash a full vortex blast to the face. So here's a hybrid build that I used and I really loved it. It's basically going to be going high points into faith with some extra points into strength and dexterity too, depending how many we have left, but basically using Euporia and the Earth Reseal since we do have a high incantation scaling with this. Also, the Horned Warrior helmet gives us some extra strength as well, and also a few of the Rakshasa items for some extra damage on top. Besides this, since we use Vortex quite a lot, we do use Shard of Alexander to boost the damage on it. Also a Sacred Scorpion Charm since we're mainly doing holy damage with this, which in the DLC is really strong. And besides this, I'm also adding a Great Shield Talisman for some defenses and also a Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. We are using the Vortex, it hits many times. Even our regular normal attacks are fast, so we can easily increase our damage from it. Besides this, we're going with the following points. We have 60 Vigor, about 22 into Mind, which I found to be quite enough despite the Vortex having quite a high FP requirement. About 28 in Endurance, and of course 80 or 70 into Faith, depending on what level you are. And everything else from this point on, I would prioritize Strength over Dexterity, you know, past just meeting the minimum requirements to equip these weapons. And also, if you want to see my Flask of Wondrous Physics, I'm using a Stone Barb Cracked Tier. It actually helps quite a lot to stun enemies easier since we are using the Charged Heavy on the Twin Blade. And you can also add a Faith Not Crystal Tier for some extra holy damage. Another build that got a double buff actually and became even stronger is the one using the Red Bear Claw, specifically while the Red Bear Hunt ability on it had an increase in attack power in the new patch and also increased poise value when using this skill, meaning that it's going to be much harder to get interrupted when using it. On top of the fact that, yeah, From Software just increased the poise damage anyway on normal attacks, on Beast Claws, as well as on dual wielding attacks. But all in all, this was already an amazing ability, the Red Bear Hunt. It's now going to be even better, like the damage you pull off is going to be off the charts. The only problem with it is that it has a rather limited range, so the hitbox is literally just like in front of you. You do have to be very close to the target to actually deal some damage. But because it's such a great skill, your poise damage with it is going to be good. You now can face tank enemies through hits much better than before, which is why I went with the Solitude Armor and went a bit more into poise. and you're going to absolutely wreck them once you also proc the bleed build up. It's only like 45, but it doesn't take too long to fully proc it if you can hit the enemies with a full blast in the face. So a build around this would look something like this. It's going to be a Beast Claw sort of build, so we can also incorporate a Beast Claw and go with the Savage Claws, for example. And besides that, since we are creating some bleed build up, I went with the White Mask and the Lords of Blood Exaltation. However, you can exchange these for something else, maybe more defenses or maybe buffing some of your other stats. Besides this, I'm also going with the Armor of Solitude, at least the chest piece. We are trading blows with enemies, so we don't want to come out at the worst end of it. Plus a couple of pieces of the Rakshasa for some extra overall damage. And besides that, Shard of Alexander, since we are using a weapon skill. Also, that double-headed turtle talisman helps a ton since we do consume quite a lot of stamina. And I'm also adding a great shield talisman to further help us just protect ourselves against some of the DLC damage. Again, I recommend going with the Stone Barbed Cracked tier for the physics tier. This is going to help you break enemy stances a bit better since you're doing all of those heavy attacks. And also an Opaline Heart tier to further boost your defenses. In terms of attributes, going with 60 Vigor, 28 into Mind, yes, it's going to be quite costly, about 32 in Endurance, and then equally 60 and 60 into Strength and Dexterity is what I would aim for, but also keeping about 25 points into Faith, since we can buff ourselves with a Golden Vow. Anyhow, keeping up with other very strong buffs, the next one is going to be the Rain of Fire, which now means our Mesmer build is going to have even more tools in its kit. Rain of Fire previously has been one of the worst, if not the worst spell in the entire game. Well, after the new patch, it's probably one of the best, at least against enemies with large hitboxes, because of its massive increase in attack power and also reduction in the interval between each hit from the fiery, well, rain. To the point that this is going to absolutely wreck enemies. It's so easy to pull off 10-15k in one single cast against some of the larger enemies like the Golden Hippo. It doesn't really make any sense to use against small targets as you're going to miss most of it and just waste the advantage, but against anything that is super large, this is going to absolutely wreck them. So like I said, this is going to be a Mesmer incantation, which is why it makes sense to add it on a Mesmer build. In this one, I kind of wanted to go with a double seal to buff the damage even more on it. So we used the Fire Knight seal to boost up the damage on it by another 10%, plus the Earth Tree seal, since we are going to have quite a bit of faith in there to boost damage. You can of course still use the Fire Knight's Greatsword with a Flame Art and having the Flame Spear on it. This is going to take advantage of the high faith anyway, or you can swap in a Blasphemous Blade if you want some healing. Of course, we are going with the Fire Knight armor as well as the Mesmer helmet to further buff damage on all of these Mesmer incantations and Ashes of War, plus the two remaining pieces from the Rakshasa set for even more extra damage. Now, in terms of the talismans, I recommend Phlox Canvas Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, and then the Great Shield Talisman. I did test the Radagon icon. It can definitely help a ton in this case. Your cast duration with the Rain of Fire is super long. However, you're still going to unleash it even if you only just put your hands on the ground. So let's say you don't finish the animation, but you did fully charge it and you've seen your character physically touching the ground with their hands. This is still going to unleash that Rain of Fire and still deal the full damage. Moving on to number 4, the next one is going to be actually a double build because 2 items got buffed, and this includes both of Romina's remembrance items, including the Rotten Butterflies as well as her Poleblade with the Romina's purification ability. So the Rotten Butterflies actually got a very high Scarlet Rot status build-up buff, to the point that you don't even need to completely finish the animation to fully cause rot build-up on any target. Bosses, players especially, doesn't really matter. But if you do get interrupted way too soon, you might miss that. So you do have to be careful because this barely gives you any poise. You're so easily interrupted in it, it's not even funny. But they did reduce the interval between damage takes and also increase the attack range on it. So especially in PvP, I think this is where you're going to probably want to use it a bit more. That being said, even in PvE it can be useful, but maybe if you want to build like a Kindred of Rot sort of setup, it's probably going to be better to go with just like the Venomous Fang or even an Ansper Rapier or anything that just does it better and faster without like fearing of being interrupted. However, the opposite is going to be true for Romina's Purification. This got a massive increase in poise value when using the skill on that Poleblade, and this makes it so much better. I previously ran with a 109 poise build. Well, between that and the new buff to the poise that you get during the animation, you're pretty much uninterruptible. There are very, very few attacks in the game that can take you out of it. So it's so easy to just unleash the damage, just cause all of that rot buildup if you want to. It's also quite decent with the exploding butterfly at causing stagger. You do need about like 3 hits, but they come so fast. Now, in terms of a build, it looks something like this. We're using the Poleblade as well as the Venomous Fang with a Poison Flower Blooms twice. So we have both the Rot as well as the Poison buildup, and we can also detonate it whenever we want. And we also have that uninterruptible animation from the Poleblade. We are using quite a lot of Faith in this case, Faith and Arcane, so the Earthly Seal might be the best option. And in terms of the armor sets, we're going with all Rakshasa pieces except the chest piece, which we're using the Armor of Solitude for, which in this case will give us 101 poise when coupling it with the Bull Talisman. So the Bull Goat Talisman is going to push that even further, and now this means we are basically uninterruptible during that special Romina attack. You can also go with a Kindred of Rot since we are causing both of those buildups, also one of those Shard of Alexander, and finally a Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman since we do trade blows every now and then or get hit during some of these animations. That's why I also like using the Opaline Heart tier and the Bubble tier, so this is going to significantly reduce our incoming damage. At number 5, our Divine Beast build got even more buffs and additional tools in its kit, specifically because of some of the buffs to the Divine Beast Tornado, and in this case it saw a really good buff to attack power. It also launches enemies upwards now, and also the tornado is less likely to disappear when colliding with the terrain. So this is actually really awesome because you can angle this assuming that there's no obstacle in sight to hit enemies twice. First on the initial hit and second right before it disappears, so you can deal double damage assuming that you have a clear terrain. But even without it, it's really good. You can actually launch enemies upwards, so it's a great way to just like use it against large groups of enemies. I like it even against larger ones because it tends to pull them towards you, so you can now couple it with the Horn Calling Storm, which is one of the abilities on the Horned Warrior Greatsword from the DLC. This one, by the way, also got a buff to its attack power, but only in PvE. So now when you pull them in with the tornado, you can then immediately follow up with a Horn Calling Storm, and you're going to unleash a ton of, well, wind elemental damage. I absolutely love that. There's no wind elemental damage, of course, in Elden Ring, but the animation on it is really cool, kind of makes you feel like the Avatar. Or you can also couple it with the other Horned Warrior, in this case, Sword. That one also got a buff on its Horn Calling ability, though I do prefer the Storm a little bit more. In terms of a build around this, you would use a Divine Beast helmet in this case, or the head to buff storm damage, also a couple of the pieces of the Rakshasa, and from that point on, we're going to go with the Enrage Divine Beast to further increase the potency of these spells, also a Shard of Alexander. Furthermore, we also use the Blast Dew Talisman, and finally a Phlox Canvas Talisman, just like we did in the previous build. However, when incorporating the new Divine Beast Tornado, we're going to actually go with a different attribute setup, so investing a lot more points into Faith, about 70, and sacrificing a bit some of that Dexterity we had before, going 60 into Vigor, about 23 into Mind, 30 in Endurance, and then just going with 60 plus into Strength and 25 plus in Dexterity, so we can meet the minimum requirements for the build. Of course, we can't forget one of the flashiest abilities in the game, which is the aspect of the Crucible Wings. I'm so happy this got a buff as well, so they increased the attack power on it and also the directional control, so it's much easier to actually control this, plus you get more poise when using the skill, meaning that it's harder to get interrupted in the middle of it. Yeah, to the point that now it's so much more amazing, especially when using it on the Greatsword or other colossal weapons, but I think that the Greatsword is its best fit. your range is going to be really high, you barely get interrupted out of it, you get all of these buffs. So now it can actually deal some very, very good damage. You can alternatively also use one on a twin blade, which is going to give you the spin instead of the poke. But I found that to be very unreliable. I kind of wish that they added a bit more control to it. In the meantime, we're just going to use the greatsword because that's just the better option. That's why we're going with a claw mark talisman, since we are going with a high strength and high faith build, going between these two. Going, of course, with a full Crucible set to buff Crucible damage, incantations, and also Ashes of War included. Besides this, we're going with the Shard of Alexander, Dragon Crest Talisman, a Holy Scorpion Charm since we are doing holy damage, and I also incorporated a Great Jar Arsenal, even though we do have high endurance here because, yeah, we're gonna otherwise be in the heavy weight category. And in terms of the stats, this is how it looks like. We basically have 60 into Vigor, 21 into Mind, which is more than enough, 40 into Endurance, 60 Strength, 15 Dexterity, and finally 70 into Arcane. And we are going to use this with a Sacred Affinity since it's going to deal higher damage despite the split damage. Testing this, it seems that the Sacred Affinity with the aspect of the Crucible Wings actually deals higher damage. And finally, the Savage Lion's Claw. I wanted to keep this one for the last as I used to love this. It now got a buff, mostly in PvE, and a slight nerf in PvP. So they increased the attack power and poise damage on the first attack. They also made the second hit follow-up attack easier to land, but they decreased the damage animation of the first attack against other players. That being said, it's going to be much better on the first hit now at staggering enemies. However, it's still not going to compare to the regular Lion's Claw from the base game. That one is still much better both at poise damage as well as pancaking enemies. And it feels that it's now much faster compared to the Savage Lion's Claw for some reason. Not sure if that's an unintended effect. But even so, really nice ability to have, and it's going to be useful on the same Crucible Knight build. If you want to go with that, it's definitely going to work wonders. You can follow pretty much the same attribute setup as before. But yeah, that's pretty much it with some of the best new builds and changes in the DLC. There are quite a few left that we haven't talked about, like the Weed Cutter, we haven't talked about it. Also, one of the Ensbach ability got a buff, and there's plenty of them in there. And unfortunately, also a few nerfs, like I said, to especially the Impenetrable Thorns. Now you can pretty much call them the Penetrable Thorns because they got absolutely smashed into oblivion. But yeah, let me know down below what other awesome spells or setups you saw having a major buff in the new update. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.